Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today. I'm Andrew Nye and I'm Head of New Product Development at Cambridge Assessment English. And I'm here today representing a collaboration between Cambridge Assessment and the Judge Business School, which is Shape Education. Shape Education has been running cross-sector events over the last 18 months, bringing people together to accelerate change in education. And you can find out more about what we're doing at shapeeducation.org and via the Cambridge Assessment website. And we're delighted to bring you Shape Live today, the third in our series of live streamed events, which we're using to think about some of the outline principles for the future of education. And you can read more about these outline principles on our website. And I'm really excited about the topic for our discussion today, which is learning, unlearning, and relearning. What do we actually mean by unlearning and relearning? Well, it's basically the idea that in our rapidly changing world, what got you here won't necessarily get you to wherever you want to go. So unlearning and relearning is a process that we all need to go through to examine our previously held beliefs, assumptions, and knowledge. In more concrete terms, there's usually some critically important unlearning that needs to be done in organizations, particularly at leadership level. And Cambridge Assessment is no exception to that. And when that unlearning doesn't happen, then it can lead to many of the issues that we see in companies today, especially those that are victims of disruption. The skills gap is something that is much talked about as organizations try to relearn, and they sometimes struggle to get the workforce skills they need to equip them for the future. How do companies help their employees develop these skills in order to address this skills gap? Well, we're going to hear from two people today with loads of interesting things to say about all of this. We're going to take our normal format of two short talks from the two speakers and then open things up to questions from you. So please do share your questions and thoughts in the chat as we go along. So to help us think about this topic and maybe to help us question some of our own assumptions, it's fantastic to be joined today by Andy Geake and Joysy John. We'll hear first from Andy, who works as a managing consultant at SHL, which helps companies attract, develop, and grow the workforce that they need to succeed in the digital era. And Andy supports a wide variety of organizations across different sectors to help them identify and develop people talent to address their organizational goals. And after that, we'll hear from Joysy, who is the CEO of 01 Founders, tuition-free coding centers with a job guarantee to improve diversity in tech. Joysy left her banking career in 2012 to change education. She's the former Director of Education at Nesta. She was appointed by the Department of Education to the EdTech Leadership Group and by the Welsh Government to the Expert Panel on Schooling Reimagined in 2019. So, Andy, over to you to get us going.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Andrew, and good to be with you all this afternoon. And Josie, good to meet you as well. I'm going to share my screen, if I may, because I've got some content I would like to share with you. So hopefully you can all see that. But one thing to say, and it was interesting what Andrew was saying about that learning, unlearning, and relearning. I've just realized that it's 40 years ago this week that I left the world of school. And I think I might have actually done some A-levels, or attempted to do some A-levels, let's put it that way, with Cambridge Assessments. So that kind of set me up there. But actually, I had a big career change about 25, 30 years ago, where having worked in the hospitality sector for various reasons, mainly due to the economy at the time, I ended up having to change and relearn, and I ended up becoming a psychologist. So in that sense, there's a very real experience in terms of having to adapt, having to move into something new, and having to try and thrive in that environment. And indeed, that's happening to a lot of employers at the moment. But I thought it would be useful really to give you a bit of a sense in terms of some of the conversations that we have with organizations, thinking about some of the themes that are coming up in terms of the sorts of things that they're talking about. And a lot of those things have been very much impacted in terms of what's happened in the world in the last 18 months or so, but some of them were kind of there before as well. And so we talk about lots of different things. And when I talk about lots of different organizations, I'm thinking about organizations in the UK, globally, public sector, private sector, across a whole range of industry sectors. And so some of them have thrived, some of them have sort of struggled, but it's really kind of thinking about what that means in terms of those organizations, but particularly, as Andrew alluded to there, in terms of what organizations will need from their people going forward. So I think in terms of some of the themes coming out, obviously transformation is coming out a lot. And that transformation was on the agenda before COVID. So organizations were looking to renew in terms of kind of being innovation, in terms of thinking competitors, in terms of thinking the industries they were in. So that's always been going along, but obviously in the last 18 months, a lot of those transformations have been speeded up. So what was a 2030 vision suddenly became a 2020 vision. And so a lot of things had to happen very quickly. And that might have been that, you know, something that was in the cards for 5 years hence suddenly became 5 weeks. So there's been very much a kind of that disruption that Andrew talked about happening in terms of people being able to be more agile, being able to kind of be more resilient, being able to kind of think a bit differently and about thinking about how people operate across organizations and beyond as well. So that transformation has really started to hit, and how can organizations start to deal with that, and how can the people start to deal with that? I think a major transformation that has impacted everyone, or certainly a lot of people, is in terms of remote working. So suddenly that upheaval from going from the office to working from home. But if you think about it, all the other challenges that went with that, because you're in your home. So how does that start to impact on people? And a lot of organizations are now beginning to think, well, do you know what? As we move forward as an organization, a big transformation is that people aren't necessarily going to be going back to an office. It may well be that they're looking for some kind of hybrid working environment, perhaps working at home, working in an office, or perhaps working in slightly different locations. So rather than an HQ, it may be something which is a bit more kind of localized for them. But that remote working had an impact in terms of how people learnt, in terms of how people had to change and how they had to adapt as well. But I think that's something we're going to see going forward. I think the other thing, and again, it does very much link in terms of what people look for in organizations, is that power of purpose. So we saw a lot of events happening in the last year in terms of climate change, in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of the whole debate, in terms of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And it kind of raised the question about, what do we want to be as an organization? What's our purpose? You know, what's our raison d'etre in terms of what people are looking for? And we talk about things like employee value propositions and so forth, but those things really matter. And if you look at particularly younger people in terms of what they're looking for in organizations, you know, some people would actually trade salary to know that they're going to work for an organization that is offering something to society. So that then has an impact in terms of that engagement part, and that engagement part impacts on the extent to which I want to feel that this organization is there for me, it's going to support me, and I want to contribute, and I want to, you know, move towards that personal growth that will help me build as a person. Obviously, automation and digitization has kicked in, and with certain sectors, that's had a profound effect, but also in terms of what people are doing, in terms of perhaps some of the skills that are going to be needed going forward. I mean, you know, a year, 2 years ago, you know, I'd probably go to the, you know, to the pizza place to go and collect my delivery or go and collect my pizza being made. Now it's being delivered to me, you know. So that has an impact in terms of what happens in that kind of work environment. There's also been that really strong focus in terms of people taking ownership for their own personal growth. So you hear about things like the growth mindset as opposed to perhaps the fixed mindset, and that's becoming very much the norm. So the days of perhaps an HR department and L&D department being the ones that, we will look after all of your learning needs. Yes, they're there to support that, but actually it's something about taking ownership for you as an individual. It's about thinking about what those skills are for the future, but thinking about your own career journey. There's a very interesting book called The 100-Year Life, where rather than you're going to a place of work and you're going to be there for 20, 30 years, actually you're going to have a range of careers. And it's thinking about how can I start to leverage some of the skills I've learned elsewhere to start supporting me in my journey to a new place. Because what we might find is actually what we thought might have been redundant in terms of those skills or know-how actually become really relevant. I think the other thing as well, and it links to this learning part, is particularly organizations, we're seeing a lot in terms of that people insight. So the organization asks themselves a question, who are our stars? Who are our hidden gems? Who are the people who we can really kind of invest in terms of, building that skill base, reskilling, upskilling? Who are those people that are going to support us going forward? But at the same time, where might we have some issues? Who are the people who may leave? Are we going to start losing people who have strong potential for the future? And I think it brings into play things to do with that kind of strategic workforce planning. So rather than just thinking about, okay, well, I need this skill for this job, it's actually thinking about what are we going to need going forward? Which of these jobs are going to be impacted by digitalization, automation? What does that mean in terms of how we start to work together? What does that mean in terms of how people start to learn? And I think these themes will continue and, in that post-pandemic world and become to resonate more and more. Now, if we then start to think about what will be needed in the future, and what I've got here is kind of reflecting some research that comes from a variety of players out there, Deloitte, McKinsey, Forbes, HBR and SHR. And it's really trying to consolidate in terms of the types of skills, stroke behaviors, and sometimes, the two mesh together that are going to be needed going forward. And these things I think are important because what was perhaps needed historically, and when I think about graduates going into the world of work, can you plan and organize? Can you communicate? And other things, and those things are obviously still there, but actually other things have come to the fore. Things like learning agility. Am I setting myself up to have that lifelong learning approach? Do I have that mindset that says, do you know what? I've got an opportunity here, but I've got to take some ownership of how I start to learn the skills I need to come up with. When we face a pandemic, am I going to be persistent? Can I deal with this in a resilient way? But also, messages in terms of how we work inclusively, how we start to create that sense of belonging, not just from the organization, but with each other. And also moving more towards collaboration, but the collaboration with intent. How can I start to share ideas? How can I start to pick up ideas from others? And also, I've got in there that coaching approach in terms of how will I support someone else in terms of giving them feedback, in terms of giving them encouragement, in terms of giving them a stretch as well. And I think there's a number of behaviors that are going to come more to the fore. And obviously from a technical skill side of it, there's more of a focus in terms of how I operate in that digital environment, data analytics, and obviously things to do with technology as well. And I remember seeing something that said that the notion of the STEM subjects is almost moved to the STEM with an I. So not just that kind of science focus, but also science with innovation. So I come up with something, but actually it creates that kind of broader good for society, which links back to that belonging piece. So I think in terms of a number of things that are coming out here, what we're seeing is a focus on people taking ownership for their own development. So in a sense, they're creating their careers. And I think any employer that sees someone coming in that is actually thinking about that, thinking in terms of what their career path might be, thinking in terms of where their journey might be, that's powerful. Because what that's saying is, do you know what, this person is starting to have that mindset to drive their own development. I think And if we think about the skills we've had to learn in the last year, this notion of lateral career moves. I mean, traditionally, succession planning used to be, well, my job takes me to that level, then the next level, then the next level. Well, actually, a lot of that experience, a lot of that capability is actually going across different parts of a business, or indeed going into different companies, different functions. Because what I'm doing is I'm building up a breadth of skills and know-how that will support me if I do want to kind of transition to something more senior. And the chances are, when I do transition to something more senior, it isn't going to be the same job that it was 2 years ago. So it's that lateral career moves which we're seeing happening. I've mentioned the growth mindset, and I think that's key. But I also think in terms of the L&D part is it linking to the individual's purpose? Are we setting ourselves up as an organization that has very much a focus in terms of we are committed and we have a strategic focus in terms of that learning and development? And it's something for the organization, not just for HR. So do we have that vision? Do we have that commitment to taking that further? I think we're going to see a huge increase in the likes of what we call network-based learning. So how do we start to share experiences? How do we start to get insight from others in the organization? How do we start to make development and learning ongoing, but actually meaningful as well? I think there's some interesting research we certainly come across is when that learning and that development, particularly in a leadership level, but at all levels as well, isn't connected to where the organization's going. So there's a kind of a disconnect there. And I think the more that that's linked into the vision and the purpose of the organization, the more traction, the more engagement there will be. But people will learn in different ways. So it may well be that I want to be in a classroom, or I want to do something virtually, or I want to do something, maybe reading, etc. So it's then thinking about what's my learning style and how's that going to impact. And I think the other thing as well, which we are seeing really kind of increase in, is this idea of kind of what we call learning circles, mentoring, reverse mentoring. So how do we start to engage a group of people on a, if you like, almost on a team or a cohort-based learning approach? So they're learning from each other, they're getting practical feedback in terms of what's gone well, maybe what's gone differently, some different perspectives as well. And it just means that the organization are becoming much more transparent and much more in terms of that collaboration piece and supporting each other, which I think is key. And I think what we're seeing as well is a lot more of an increase in terms of mentoring and indeed reverse mentoring. Because if I think about it, I was running a Teams meeting last year, and none of us on the call had a clue what we were doing. And I had to ask my 9-year-old daughter, who's grown up, obviously, with technology, to come and actually facilitate and show us how to do things. So there's something about, whatever your age is, there's an opportunity to learn from each other, regardless of whether or not you've been there 30 years or you've been there 30 days. So that whole reverse mentoring process as well. But this just really gives you a sense in terms of where we're going in the future. I hope that's all right, Andrew.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Andy, for that overview. So please do keep adding questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try to cover as many as possible after Joysy has spoken. So Joysy, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. So it's fantastic to be here and to be part of this discussion around learning and unlearning. And some of the stories that Andy just mentioned around career change and going through a different phase in your career. Over my last 2 decades, I've had 4 different careers, from being a technologist to being a banker to being an entrepreneur, and working in the edtech space and in the charity sector. So I think the people who are now entering the workforce are going to have multiple careers over the lifespan, especially if they're going to be living until 100 years. So the topic that I wanted to speak about today is, how do we optimize learning when you're living in a digital world, and what sort of digital pedagogy might help? But before we delve deeper into this, I wanted to first ask you, what is digital pedagogy? Because some people might think it's about building digital skills, or it's about only online learning, or the learning that is happening in the classroom, but it's using digital tools, or it's a blend of the two. So if you can just look at the poll and look at what sort of reactions you have, or initial lessons around things that you think constitute digital pedagogy. So I'm just going to give you a second there to reflect on that question and try and answer, what is digital pedagogy? Okay. So you'll see that a lot of people have different views around what digital pedagogy is. But in terms of the true definition, it's a combination of all these things, whether it's online courses, whether you're using a TV or a radio or a phone to learn, or you're learning about digital tools. It's a combination of both being able to use these digital technologies, but also being able to build those skills that are crucial to thrive in the future. So why is digital pedagogy important? You can see that in the news, you hear a lot about the digital skills gap, and especially about the fact that the tech sector is not diverse. So there's a huge discrepancy in terms of the demand for these digitally skilled workers in areas such as coding, but also the opportunity to retrain in these areas for millions of people who have been made redundant as a result of the COVID-19 recession. And with the world that is highly driven by algorithms and automation, you need a much more diverse range of people shaping these algorithms and the way these systems work. So I think everyone understands the need for digital pedagogy. So there is a clear recognition of the need and the need for change. Andy mentioned earlier how the change that would have taken 10 years has happened in a year's time just because we were forced to change. But the question still remains, are people willing and able to change? And some of the barriers that come in when you are talking about digital pedagogy is that there might be some people who are still unwilling to change, whether that is due to the motivation of learners or the mindset of teachers or inertia from parents, because they're used to a certain way of teaching, where the teacher stands on a stage and imparts knowledge to learners who learn that and then regurgitate that in an exam. But there's also a question around ability, and are they able to access the internet? Do they have the right devices? Is there enough funding and resources available? Is there a culture of learning and capacity within the system to help people with digital learning? So having looked at those barriers, there's a lot that's going on in terms of adopting new ways of learning and working. And COVID-19 has been one of those moments where we are looking at things differently. So every industry seems to have changed, but the education system still remains the same. And this is an opportunity for us to think differently and look at new ways of learning. So I'm going to just share a specific case study of 01 Founders. This is a new venture that has been launched by Founders Forum, 01 Talent, and Capital City College Group, where we are taking learners, anyone about the age of 18. There is no prior experience required for coding skills. As long as you have the right attitude, and motivation and resilience to learn, this is tuition-free learning with a job guarantee. So what's the problem that we're trying to address? The digital skills gap is a huge threat to our economy. And the problem is threefold, because firstly, there's a lack of software engineers. Secondly, the education system hasn't really evolved to keep in touch with the digital age. And finally, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds find that tertiary education is extremely expensive. You go to university and come out with a debt, and in many cases, no job in sight. So what are we doing to solve this problem? 01 Founders is a peer-to-peer gamified learning pedagogy, which is shaped by employers as well as a powerful AI-based technology platform. It is tuition-free, it is on campus, and it's a sustainable business model where we are concerned about not just the number of learners we have, but ensuring that every one of them has a job at the end of their learning. And right from the beginning, they're working on real-world projects with employers rather than sitting in a classroom and listening to a lecture. Now, taking this particular case study, how can we make a much broader difference within the education system itself? Here I've shared one specific example of what we are doing in the adult reskilling and upskilling space. But some of these lessons can be applied across the sector. And those are, firstly, it's about supporting the intrinsic motivation that learners have. As long as people are excited and motivated to learn, they will find a way to address the challenges and be resilient when things don't go a certain way. And secondly, it's about building the right skills and the knowledge. It's not enough to just have technical skills or coding skills. People also need to have creativity, critical thinking, collaborative problem solving skills in order to thrive both today and in the future. And it's about engaging diverse learners, not just those who can afford to go to university or afford a coding bootcamp. And finally, it's about using technology creatively so that technology is not seen as something that replaces human, but as something that complements human capabilities. And finally, it's about making sure that there are opportunities for learners to have work experience so that they can build these skills in a much more practical, real life, and engaging manner. This change cannot happen by us working individually. We need to be working together to achieve greater impact. And that's why there's a huge need to work with government, with academia, with businesses, and the civil society to ensure that we are giving everyone an opportunity to learn and thrive in the future. We are building the most diverse industry-leading software engineers of tomorrow, and our applications are currently open. So if anyone is interested in finding out more, then please do go on our website, 01founders.co, and I'm happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joysy. So we've got about 15 minutes now for Q&A. So I'll kick off with a couple of questions. And as I said before, do everyone please post any comments and questions in the chat as we're going along. Andy, perhaps the first question for you to start with. So we in the abstract for this session, we referred to a McKinsey survey, and that survey highlighted some of the difficulties that employers and employees have around the L&D that they do, and you touched on some of that in your talk. And so I guess the question is how, you talked about getting employees to take ownership for their own growth, but if they don't really know what they need to be learning, they don't really know what these skills are that they need for the future. Where do we start? How do we get them to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Andrew. And I think I guess part of it is, so there's two things. There's what am I inclined towards? So what do I enjoy doing? Where do I, do I want to be a lawyer? Do I want to be this, that, and the other? What is my focus there? But then it's thinking about, okay, well, if I see this as a bit of a career journey for me, what are things that I can do as an individual that can facilitate that? So for example, if I'm someone that enjoys working with people, for example, but I also I like analysis, how can I start to think, and maybe I work in retail, how is it, but maybe those types of roles may start to change and may start to disappear going forward. How can I start to leverage those elements into something that may be maybe kind of more of a growth area in the future? So it's really getting people to think about what is it they enjoy doing, what is it they want to do, and actually at a very early stage, it's getting them and encouraging them to think about, okay, well, we can do certain things as an organization, but actually some of this comes back to you in terms of how you take ownership of that. And certainly what we found is that when there are opportunities for sharing, so I mentioned things to do with learning circles, that type of thing, that's actually quite a good way of, if you like, changing mindsets, getting people to sort of think about, okay, well, I hadn't thought about that way before. I hadn't thought about that approach. Or I didn't realize that I could go and learn that. Almost that sort of informal process that people can start to think about, okay, well, maybe I need to think about things differently here, or the organization will give me so much, but actually I need to develop more of a mindset where that development is more within my hands to shape. And I think one of the interesting things is that in the poll that we did, I noticed that there was a question about how the class, as it were, I think of 21 compared to the class of 01 might be different, and there was something in terms of more change, more adaptable in that sense. So it's really kind of leveraging that. But I think what you'll find in organizations is that it's about, okay, where do we need to go to in the future? So we've got workforce planning, but then there's kind of more strategic planning. And what does that mean in terms of perhaps some of the skill sets that are we going to need? But us as an organization, how can we give individuals some of that ownership, some of that support to take on board some of that learning themselves? Because it may well be that we can't take them off on a big 2-week development workshop or anything like that, but actually there are, if you like, bite-sized bits of learning they can do. Maybe there are nudges that we can give them that kind of say, oh, well, that was interesting because we know that you had expressed an interest in this. Have you read this? Have you thought about this? And I think, to come back to the point that Joysy made actually, which was about that kind of lifelong learning in the sense that your career isn't necessarily going to be the same career forever. I've had that experience, Joysy's had that experience. And it's thinking about, okay, well, what is it that I have picked up? What is it that I've learned? And actually, how can I start to leverage that to support me in other areas?
Great. Joysy, do you want to comment on any of that? And there's also a related question in the chat, which I'll pass your way as well. Would giving learners more autonomy in education produce more autonomous behaviors in the workplace? So, I mean, you touched on some of the issues about school. So do you want to just comment on that question and anything Andy said as well?
Sure. I definitely think that we need people who can adapt to changing environments, and that's sort of, the world that is moving so fast that the answers are not in textbook, but you need to find solutions to complex problems by working with teams, working with people with diverse skill set. And when I say learner agency and learner ownership, that means that people are driving their learning, they're personalizing it to their needs, their interests, their motivation. And that sort of environment, if you are building those skills in the education system, when you come out into the workforce, or even when during various phases of your working life, you're not only going to be you'll have much more autonomy when you're working, but also have this notion of working collaboratively in teams to solve problems. So I think it's a combination of both independence, but also collaboration. Then the second thing around what Andrew was mentioning in terms of your career and figuring out what you enjoy doing and what you're good at. I think I would add one more thing of also think about where there is a demand and need, because you can be fantastic at, say, uh, singing, for example, but maybe there's a need for some other sort of skill set. So could you build that skill set? So I think it's a combination of what are you good at, what do you love doing, and what does the world need? And if you look at the problem now, as I was saying earlier, right, like there will be 3 million new jobs created that require digital skills by 2025. And if we aren't training enough people with those skills, then there is a huge problem for our economy, for well-being, for people who might be displaced because they don't have the right skills. And that's why we need to put that intrinsic motivation back in, where people feel excited by learning. They feel, they are in control rather than somebody else controlling their learning.
Great. We've got people watching today from Argentina, Singapore, Uruguay, Indonesia, and Zimbabwe. And there's a question coming from Oscar in Singapore. And he says, as a GCSE student, how do I motivate my learners? How do I motivate my peers to learn and see the value in learning like I do? Which kind of goes to that intrinsic motivation point, Joysy. I don't know if either of you have...
that's really interesting. Great question, Oscar. I think one of the things we need to be aware of is understanding that everyone is different. Some people might want to learn by reading text. Some might want to learn by listening to text. Some might want to learn by, building something. And as long as we are aware that everyone is different and we don't impose a one size fits all, I think learning will be fun for everyone. In terms of how do you influence your peers, I think it's about seeing the benefit to them. So if you have a certain way of working, being able to communicate that with your peers and saying, why you're excited by it, but also think about the other person and what benefits it brings to them, because the best way to influence somebody is to show them what's in it for them. So that would be my advice to you, Oscar.
Yeah, and I would say on that, I totally agree with that. And I'd say to Oscar as well, that by having those conversations, by having that kind of, if you like, group approach to thinking about things, you're going to be able to share ideas. You're going to be, you'll be able to challenge each other and potentially stretch each other. And I think the other thing as well, and I come back to the reverse mentoring point, that sometimes we can take this view that, organizations dictate what we're going to need going forward. And, that somehow, if you're a graduate or you're a school leaver, that, you're a blank slate, whatever. But think about some of the things, the skills that you have already. And whether that be, I'm working with a more diverse group of people, maybe it's more about, how we can start to leverage technology. Think about the skills that you can bring that actually will support the organization as well. And I think if you get into that kind of mindset, that it isn't just one way thing, but actually this can work two ways, then I think that lends itself to more engagement and a more positive experience when you go to the workplace.
Okay, great. Andy, you talked about the breadth of skills that people need to develop and lateral career moves. And there's a question here that relates to that, where somebody's asked, training is easier to come by than experience, which is often more important to moving to new roles. Do we need more mid-career internships to help people get the experience they need?
I think those sort of things can work quite well. I mean, certainly what we find is that sometimes an organization, particularly if they connect up with another organization that isn't necessarily a competitor or whatever, they might say, but you know what, we've got some complementary skills here. We can offer this, but they can offer that. And actually, if we were to spend some time, or someone was to spend some time there, that could be really beneficial, not just for that organization, but actually for us as well. So I think there are opportunities at each level to, to keep that learning going, but to gain those kind of broader experiences and perspectives. I mean, the other way to think about it, of course, is someone may have a lot of experience, but is that experience going to be needed as we go forward. So what is the relevance there? And actually, perhaps at a more junior level, what is being brought into the organization that actually, if we tap into, that's actually going to support a number of different levels of that organization as well. But certainly where people have had those opportunities to perhaps work across different parts of the business, or indeed beyond their own companies, and certainly when they get opportunities for perhaps kind of more international interaction, that can be a real positive for growth.
Somebody's asked a question here. What is the percentage rate in terms of retaining information that they learn, which links to something I wanted to ask about, which is, it comes up a lot in organizations, I think, which is about return on investment for training. And, you know, employers, directors of L&D, they want to be able to measure the return on investment for the learning that's taking place. So how do they do that? How, particularly if actually the employees may be actually learning things, they may be taking away completely different things in terms of the learning that's going on from what was intended. So what are your thoughts on how that works? Because demonstrating value from this is critical for employers.
Yeah. I think in terms of retention rates, that will vary depending on how interesting the subject is, how well it's taught, and how engaged the learner is. So I won't have a percentage that I can give you, but the movement towards micro learning is an interesting one, given that employers realize that expecting learners to take a really big chunk of time away just to learn and then come back and forget that is not very helpful. So now there's this concept of shorter bursts of learning, or learning on the job, which helps you retain more of that information, but also apply it directly in a problem that you might be facing at work. So I think people are aware of making sure that the learning modules are more relevant and more practical. In terms of how do you demonstrate ROI, I think it's much more about, you know, where is the person currently in terms of skills and knowledge? And after having gone through the training, how have they progressed in terms of skills, capabilities, attitudes? Because it's not just, you know, a technical skill that you can measure in terms of a test. It's also how well you're leading, how well you're communicating, how well you're influencing. So there are those softer things that need to be measured in a qualitative way. So I would say the ROI would come from increased productivity, increased innovation, increased collaboration, and teamwork as well.
And I'd go along with that as well, Josie. And it's the holy grail question that we get all the time, which is how do we show ROI on this? And I guess there's a number of ways of doing that. You know, if someone goes on a course and a program and they really enjoy that and they get huge amounts of engagement on it, but we don't necessarily see that happening in the workplace, does that mean there hasn't been a return on investment? So there's a question then in terms of, you know, okay, well actually we were doing something to support that individual. And they felt engaged by it, they felt invested in, they felt a sense of belonging. And in a sense, that's a positive as much as anything else. I think, as Josie said, do we start to see some other return? So people do things like 360-degree feedback. Did we see, you know, more of that behavior from that individual? Is this manager being more belonging in their approach? But also in things like succession. So if I've got critical roles for the future, am I starting to kind of, if I invest in my own internal talent, do I see those roles progressing to those individuals? So do I start to see some development there? So I think you can look at it in a number of different ways. So there's kind of, if you like, more of the kind of quantitative metrics that come off the back of it, but there's something else in terms of, do I feel invested in? And has that kind of enhanced my kind of feeling about, you know, what learning means for me? And that's another key thing as well. So there's almost that emotional qualitative outcome as well.
Okay, there's a lot more questions in the chat, and there's a load more that I wanted to ask as well, but we're out of time. So I really only have time left to say thank you so much to both Andy and Joysy for your your ideas, your talks, and the discussion that we've had. Thank you also to the team behind the scenes that keeps these events running, and thanks to all of you for joining. We will continue these discussions at future live streams and at our upcoming bigger Shape events, and we will answer the questions that we haven't had time to answer today on LinkedIn. If you're interested in getting more involved in Shape, then please register at shapeeducation.org, and have a lovely rest of your day, and we hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.